Hello, folks. If it weren't for the United States nuclear deterrent, we would have ceased to exist a long time ago. We would be speaking another language. Somebody else would be ruling us. We need a nuclear deterrent. And to maintain a nuclear deterrent is a lot of work and expense, and things have to be done right. And that's why my guest here, Doug Arion, a professor of physics and a person who worked for Science Application International Corps, which worked on nuclear survivability, is here to tell us about a thing called plutonium pits. And plutonium pits are crucial to our nuclear deterrent. Well, and that's as much as I know. And the rest of it I'm going to ask Doug. So why do they call it a pit? When I first heard the word, I thought, oh, a plutonium pit is a pit they throw plutonium into. But no, it's not. It's like a bowling ball sized chunk of plutonium, right? Tell me more about plutonium pits.
So the function of a nuclear weapon, and for any of you who might have seen, the movie Oppenheimer, for example, which was a tremendous study on some of that and other films, the basic function is that there are a couple of materials, plutonium is one of them, that if you compress it enough so that the atoms are close together, they release tremendous amounts of energy. Nuclear reactions happen, boom, thing goes off.
So let me ask a question here. The atoms have to get crunched so close together that what happens?
So the reason we have what's called a chain reaction is when one of these atoms breaks, it spits out a couple of neutrons, and those neutrons make the next atoms break. And that one splits out a couple of neutrons. And so it's sort of like the old thing about if you get a penny today, two tomorrow, four the next day, you're a millionaire by the end of the month. This is the same thing. One atom goes, then 2, 4, 8, 16, 30, except it grows really, really fast. So you have to make sure that every neutron hits another one. So they've got to be really close together.
Okay. So when the atoms break, what's happening when they break?
So the actual thing that is the atom, the nucleus of the atom, actually breaks into multiple pieces, and that releases energy. That's where the energy comes from. When you break the atom apart, energy comes out, and a lot of energy comes out, more than any other way you can do it anywhere else in the universe.
And what's in the nucleus of an atom?
Actually breaks. Right?
What's it made up of?
It's made out of protons and neutrons.
Okay.
And so when that breaks up, it breaks up into two atoms that are smaller atoms.
And so they have to be very close together. Otherwise, these neutrons would just shoot into space.
Exactly. They don't hit anything. It doesn't split the next atom. And then you don't have, the reaction going off in a big way.
How do you get them how do you get them close together like that?
Well, the way these work, and it goes all the way back to the device that was, tested at Trinity and the one that was dropped on Nagasaki, is you have a blob of material, the stuff, plutonium, and it's actually more complicated than that, and I'll get to that in a minute. And you surround that with explosives, and you surround that by something that's pretty stiff and hard. So when the explosives go off, that explosion actually crushes solid metal. Think about that. You're crushing solid metal to the point that those neutrons have no place to go, and poof, the thing goes off.
So didn't the first bomb work a different way? It was more like a gun charge?
Correct. So the other way you could get enough material in one place is you have two blocks of it and you fire them at each other. And that's the way the device that was used at Hiroshima works. It's not very efficient because as the blocks get close, it starts to blow up, and that blows away a lot of the material. So it's not very efficient. You don't, for all the stuff you put in there, you only use a small fraction of it to produce real explosions.
So the reason we're here are these plutonium pits. And why is it called a pit? Is it like the pit of an orange, or the?
Yeah, it's like the pit.
I mean, a pit of a peach. Oranges don't have pits.
Exactly, or a plum. Right, it's at the center, and then it's surrounded by all this other material. So it's down in the middle like the pit of a fruit. Exactly.
And they're about the size of a bowling ball.
Well, it depends on the device, the weapon. There are some where the entire thing is the size of a softball, and the pit is about, the size of a ping pong ball, all the way up to things which are the size of, a cantaloupe. So it all depends on what it's for, how it's launched,
I
what it's
see.
doing.
So this is not just the storage of plutonium. It's already in the form of a charge that would be used in a nuclear device. You just stick it in the device.
Right. And it has to be manufactured. So the thing about the way these things work is it's not just a ball of metal. There are other things that are put in there in layers to make it extremely efficient. And that's something that the US has been very good at going back many, many decades, because we have really good computers. And because of that, we can figure out how to make these things so we use less plutonium to make the same amount of bang as somebody who doesn't have that capability. And that means the whole thing is smaller and lighter, which means you can throw it farther or throw more of them or throw them with a smaller gun. I mean, there are all these things that come out of that. And that's part of this whole, effort on these new plutonium pits, because these things are complicated, and the goal is to upgrade all the pits in all the weapons in the US inventory.
So we're not replacing them because they're old. I mean, because they are aging and falling apart. We're replacing them because we want better ones.
It's actually some of both, and it's related to the fact that we really don't know how these things behave as they age. So, the way you can tell, how's the glue in your chair holding up over years? Well, you can take a chair, put some weight on it, and you say, okay, well, once the glue's been in there for 30 years, it tends to break. We should re-glue the chairs, right?
Yeah.
Well, we stopped testing bombs in 1992. A lot of your listeners weren't born in 1992. That's 32 years
Right.
ago we stopped testing. Now, their tests are still done on the explosives themselves and the detonators and all that, but you can't detonate a bomb. It's not allowed. I mean, we chose not to do that anymore. And so there's a lot of question as to really what the total reliability of everything really is. And there's a whole program called Stockpile Stewardship that's working on that.
Interesting. Do you happen to know if other countries are as careful about this as we are? Like, for example, Russia, are they careful with testing their stuff, or is it just in some padlocked warehouse somewhere?
They've been careful with their stuff. I think, given their current administration, I think I'd be, and again, this is without any factual background, but just I would be concerned about where they're stored and whether they're being maintained well, just in their administration. And then you have other countries like North Korea, which have been building and testing actual weapons. They have had a number of nuclear tests that have been done, because they're not a signatory to any treaty. In fact, they're kind of anti-treaty. When you think about how they're doing things, they're still testing their own missiles and developing their own nuclear weapons.
Are they actually doing nuclear blast tests above ground?
Not above ground, underground.
Underground. Okay.
So that they're at least not doing it in the atmosphere. They're doing it underground.
Okay. And we know when they do that just from the seismic activity or the radioactive activity too?
Both.
Interesting.
Yeah. We know for sure.
So we have established the issue now that we don't really know how old the old plutonium pits last or hold up. Plus, now we know how to make better ones. The initiative is to replace every one. How many are there?
There are thousands of them out there in fielded weapons. And so, the goal is, you work through different series of them. So there are particular warheads that are on the Trident missiles, which is on our submarines. There are particular warheads that are on our missiles and silos. There are particular weapons that are in our artillery scale nuclear devices. So each of them has a different configuration, and so you work your way through the system and replace those.
Now, I read, and I don't see how this can be true if they're going to replace them, that at this point, you're not able to make active new ones. We're only allowed to research and develop at this point, something like that. Is that true?
Right. So, I mean, we're not adding to the inventory of fielded weapons. We're maintaining them. And some of this is, aimed at the maintenance side. But
so how do you? So you want to So you can't make new ones. You have to upgrade the old ones. How do you do that? How do you take one of these and make it better or update it?
So that's where things get a little more complicated in that what you want is you want all those neutrons to do their job, right? So that's the first thing you need to do. And the second thing is that the other particles that come out and the neutrons that are coming out can make other things go. So you can have, the plutonium reacts, and that's the basic thing, but you can put other materials in there that the neutrons hit and help fuse. So you can actually have these things, what are called boosted weapons. So, and this goes back into the late 1940s, is that while the plutonium is exploding, you can put in some gas, some light gas, and that gets compressed, and that goes through fusion reactions, and that adds to it. And the fusion reactions release more neutrons, which cause more of the plutonium to go. So they feed back on each other.
Wow.
You find ways to create these by adding other bits of material, different things on the inside, the outside, to continue to do two things. One is to continue to make the explosion more efficient, right? We need smaller things, lesser stuff to do it. And also to produce particular collections of radiations. You can dial in by what you put around these things, whether the whole thing makes more neutrons, whether the whole thing makes more gamma rays, whether the thing makes more X-rays. And so you can dial in what you want it to do if you were going to use it in the field.
So you have different ones that emanate different stuff depending on the application?
Right, exactly.
What,
so you may remember, you and I are old enough to remember back in the late 70s, there was a thing called the neutron bomb.
Oh, yeah.
The neutron bomb. And the key for that was by designing certain materials around it, you could create a big flood of neutrons, and neutrons decay into gamma rays. And what that would do is it would be, we'll talk about the method, the ethics of this in a minute, but it would be better at killing people and doing less damage to infrastructure. Mm-hmm. And you produce less blast, but you produce more radiation. So if you're trying to take territory, right, the assumption of this is the Russians have gone into Germany, we're trying to fight them back. You don't want to destroy Germany in the process of beating the Russians. So you'd have a way of killing off soldiers, and yet the buildings would stay standing or get less damage, so that you would then be able to reconstruct the environment afterwards. So you would put in a material that would absorb certain parts of the explosion, and that radiation would then produce an extra flow of neutrons, which would create radiation without creating as much blast.
By the way, in a neutron bomb, do you have to wait a while before you go into the buildings that are standing because they're all radioactive?
Right. I mean, there would be certain aspects of that you would have to deal with. I mean, that's going to be true with the use of any of these devices, but again, you would have control over more of these things.
So say I'm going to upgrade one, take one of these bowling balls, and they peel back the different layers and layers and layers to get to the core, and then rebuild it around the core. And then I guess once you get to the core, you check it out, see if it's degraded, and then you say, oh, it's still solid, it's still good. Then you rebuild the layers around it to be more efficient.
Right, exactly. And in fact, the goal, this is being done in Los Alamos. Remember, we have several national laboratories, each producing things. Los Alamos, the one in northern New Mexico, is the place where all of these new pits are going to be made. And I'll tell you some of the logistics about that in a minute. But new pits will be made for these things. As each device gets opened up, a new pit goes in, the old pit can come out. You can recycle the plutonium and materials and use them in making a next
I was wondering about that. You re-refine the old pit, and how do you, not to get too in the weeds, but how do you do that?
I think much the way that you recycle other metals. I mean, metals can be melted and remachined and made into new things. So I assume that's the process. I don't know the details of the plutonium recycling process that they're going to use.
It seems kind of risky to have it all done in one place. And as I understand it, they want to build another one in Savannah River, near the Savannah River, or on the Savannah River, right?
Right.
Trying to do that.
So, I mean, starting with World War II, there were a number of special facilities built specifically to make these metals that would ultimately go into the bombs. So the famous ones are Oak Ridge and Hanford. Oak Ridge was doing U-235 and 238 separation for that bullet bomb, the first kind we talk, where things get shoved together. And Hanford, Washington, and then ultimately in Savannah, Georgia, you were having plants that were making the plutonium, isolating the plutonium to be used in these devices.
By the way, can you use the old pits for nuclear power plants?
We generally, our power plants don't use plutonium, they use uranium.
Ah,
But in principle, one could do those things. You'd have to engineer it. Personally, I find the whole nuclear industry a little baffling because we take out this old fuel that is still so radioactive, we have to store it very specially, but we're not using it to make power, which seems very silly. I think that there are opportunities where we could do something valuable with that material as opposed to just throwing it into pools and hoping nothing hurts it.
so it's got enough juice in it to be dangerous and probably to make some sort of power or do something, and we just waste it.
Right. I mean, it's not powerful enough to turn water into steam for steam turbines, but there are other ways of making electricity from the heat that is generated, and I wish we would do that. That's a whole other industry that I'm not in, but it's something I'd like to see.
So I guess we've covered the. Is there anything I have not covered regarding pits before I have questions about survivability, since that's what you know about a lot about?
Yeah. Well, one of the interesting aspects, I was just in New Mexico in October because there was the annular total eclipse, and I visited some folks up in Los Alamos. And I was just talking to one of the docents there who was saying, firstly, if you want a job and you're looking for a job, head to Los Alamos. They're hiring like crazy because they need a tremendous staff to do all of this work. There are these thousands of pits that need to be done. There's a lot of work that goes into it. So they're looking to hire a lot of people. And interestingly, these days in Los Alamos, I mean, they have a housing crunch. If they hire all these people, they've got to find a place for all these people to live, and schools and all these other things. I mean, the town has been a pretty modest size for a long time, but now they're looking to staff up to do all this work and facing the logistic issue of what happens when you hire. I think they're looking to hire like 3,000 people.
Wow.
I mean, serious hiring to do this work.
And you can't touch this stuff. How do you do it? You work with robots?
There are robotic systems. There are shielded areas. Yeah, there's a lot of automation that goes into doing all that. It has to be. You don't just pick it up with your hand. That would not be good. So it all has to be done in very controlled environments.
I think I saw some back in the day, 50s experiments where some guy actually accidentally did, they had these balls, and you've probably seen the footage, and it's like, whoops, right. And he touched it or something, and he was toasted pretty quickly.
Right, right. So there were experiments being done. Remember, this is 1944, 1945. We knew the basic physics, but not the numbers. So it's like, we know if a neutron hits this atom, this is what happens, but how close does the neutron have to be, and that's what we call a cross section, right? I mean, if you shoot at a target, what's going to happen if you hit the target, but if you don't know how big the target is, you can't calculate where it is. So how do you do that? Well, you would start shooting and seeing what happens. Well, what they did is they took two blobs of this stuff, and the goal was, you have a Geiger counter counting how many reactions you get, and you get them closer and closer. And once you get close enough, Geiger counter goes up fast. You go, okay, now we know how much stuff we need. We can back it off. In this particular case, they were allowed to basically hit each other. And the thing would have gone, because a screwdriver slipped. There was a screwdriver being
right.
apart. Screwdriver slips, the things slide together, and the scientist who was working on it literally reached in and pulled the things apart. And of course, he not only was he holding it, but to get close enough, all this radiation's coming out, and he was dead in a week.
Yeah.
Painfully dead in a week. I mean, it's not just like, oh, you're there and you die in a week. I mean, your skin flakes off, your body swells out. It's nasty. It's seriously nasty.
One of the first books I ever read was On the Beach as a kid. Are you familiar with that book?
I haven't
It's
read
a book
it.
a book by a guy named Neville Shute. And it was after a nuclear apocalypse, and it turns out Australia was the last country, for some reason, prevailing winds made that the last surviving place. And it was about his last days driving around in his Aston Martin. It's very weird, and for a little kid to read, is kind of sad. This is a weedy question. Now, you and I have talked a lot about physics and about the Copenhagen notion that
Right.
two particles can be at the same place, two places, at once. Now, these are photons usually in those experiments, but does any of that come into play in these nuclear devices when things go up? Like, you need to know where particles are going, but you really can't know where certain particles are going. Now, I know a photon is different than a neutron, of course, but
Right.
is any of that in play?
Well, firstly, actually, all of this, what we talk about, the spooky action at a distance thing, would work with any particles. Neutrons will do the same thing.
Okay.
We just don't play with them because photons are a lot cheaper and easier to play with. So we do a lot of the physics with photons, but it would apply to any particle. But the things that we're working with here are on a very dense, very close, very small scale. So those things aren't an issue.
Because it really doesn't matter where it
much
exactly.
more mechanical scale.
Okay.
Neutron hits, energy goes in, too many particles in the nucleus reacts by splitting, gamma rays are released as the things come down. I mean, that physics, it's a different regime where those other effects aren't.
Okay. So here we are at nuclear survivability. That was what your job was, is determining that. I guess you would go to sites and look at specific site survivability. And of course, there's a new, for years we kind of forgot about all that. And now we kind of think about it more because of what's going on in the world. People wonder about survivability. Some will say, oh, yes, there is no survivability. And yet you're studying survivability. So there must be some. I mean, can you address that?
Sure. So when we talk about nuclear survivability, our goal was that our military capability would be able to withstand a nuclear attack and still be in a position to retaliate. And the advantage of this, remember, that's a purely defensive thing. And I'd like to point out here that while I understand things about nuclear weapons, everything I've ever done has been on the defensive side. I've never developed a weapon. I've never done any work to hurt anything. I would not work on that. But from a defensive perspective, that's a very important thing. And so the best offense is a good defense. If we're impregnable, we can go ahead, hit me with your best shot, which is a really good song, by the way. Hit me with your best shot. And I'm still going to be here. And therefore, that deters you from launching, right? Because it's like, you can do it, but you're going to waste all your weapons and everything, and I'm going to come back and still be there.
Right. And if the moment they thought that our military response was not something that could survive, they have a huge motive to go ahead and first strike.
Exactly. And so having that great defense is a tremendous part of the deterrent. So I and my colleagues in this field were responsible for designing, evaluating, and testing each of our military assets such that it can complete its mission even in a nuclear environment. So for example, our most important assets are our communication satellites, right? If you can't talk to the folks on the field, you're done, right? They need to know what to do. So communication is number one. So we have these satellites, they're way up. They're very far up. They're 22,000 miles away. And there are these satellites that carry the communications. That's really important to protect. So the circuitry, the kinds of materials, the kind of software on them, all of that was designed so that they could be hit by radiation in space, basically turn themselves off, turn themselves back on, just the same way you do a 3-finger salute on a computer. When it gets confused, it can just reset itself. And it would come back on and be ready to go. All of that in a matter of a fraction of a second. So communication would continue. Well, how do you know that that really works? Well, we would actually take one of these satellites, go into a tunnel in Nevada, in the middle of the desert, put it in a big tank so it thinks it's flying, big vacuum tank. And a few thousand feet away in a long tunnel, we call them devices, but it's a bomb. Okay, let's admit it's a bomb. One of these nuclear things, and set it off, and the radiation would hit the satellite, and the satellite has a cable into it, so it thinks it's flying, and we can actually watch all the circuitry and say, oh yeah, okay, it did what it's supposed to do. Now we know that this thing's going to be okay, and we can fly this satellite, and if they attack it, okay, we know we're going to be okay. And we did that for everything: satellites, our rockets, our own weapons, making sure that if you attack our silos, our weapon will still work if we have to launch it back. Our ground equipment that the Army uses, that those communication systems and weapon systems would still survive, all those things would work. It was very complicated work. I mean, you're bringing this whole system a couple of miles underground and cabling it up and testing it all.
And you have to somehow recreate the amount of radiation that you expect.
Correct.
The attack. You have to calculate that and use your best guess, I guess.
Correct.
It would seem to me that by now there would have been satellite wars, killer satellites. That would seem to be something that China could pretty easily do.
So there are two sides of this. In fact, actually, we just did a symposium on this the other day. I was in Wisconsin, where we had a bunch of space law experts. We were talking about these issues. So two sides of it. One is there actually is a treaty that says you can't put a weapon in space, a nuclear weapon in space. And of course, everybody has to abide by the treaty, right? If somebody goes and does it, what are you going to do? But China, Russia, the United States, Great Britain, France are signatories to that treaty. So far, everybody's agreed we're not going to put weapons in space. The flip side, though, is nobody says you can't do something from the ground and affect something in space. So as a matter of fact, last year, the Russians, this will blow your mind, actually destroyed one of their old dead satellites. They launched a rocket from the ground that went up and intentionally hit one of their satellites and blew it up to test an ability of what's called an ASAT, an anti-satellite weapon. And this is a really serious issue because, firstly, you don't want somebody shooting down satellites. And secondly, it creates all this debris. So imagine when you have an accident on the highway, if the accident is just the two cars hit each other, you can drive around them no problem. It's just annoying that they're there. But most accidents spray shrapnel all over the road, and now it's dangerous to drive by it, right? Well, that's what this does. It puts all this debris up in space. It's all moving 17,500 miles an hour. So there are bullets flying around at 17,000 miles an hour that could put all sorts of other spacecraft at risk. So destroying things in space is seriously nasty, and the Russians did it last year. Really pissed off a lot of people in the space community.
I bet. I mean, couldn't you destroy it without blowing it up? You could. I don't know.
Yeah, but the basic way to do things is you basically fire a big bullet at it, and
that's the cheapest, fastest way to do it. Yeah,
cheapest, fastest way to do it. Exactly.
And they did that just to show they could, etc.
Yeah, exactly.
Wow.
Interesting, isn't it? When you
look at
this.
It's all very real, and I try not to think about it too much, but I like thinking about the science part of it.
Yeah,
this is great. Tell me a little bit about the eclipse that you saw a month ago.
Yeah, so periodically the moon passes in front of the sun, and if you're standing in the shadow, you see these amazing effects. The one in October, the moon in its orbit happened to be on average a little farther away, right? Its orbit's some a little closer, a little farther away. And so when it passed in front of the sun, a ring of the sun, it was a little smaller than the sun, so a ring of sun was left. It's called an annular eclipse. It's absolutely spectacular. It's called a ring of fire, because you see this ring of fire in the sky. Mm-hmm. Absolutely spectacular thing to see. It's a great taste because April 8th, of course, we have a total eclipse crossing the country, something that everybody should make sure they get to see, because the next one in the U.S. isn't until 2045. Wow. So we've got over 20 years till we see another one here in the country. So it's an amazing thing. The next eclipse crosses from Texas up through New England and the Maritimes. Great thing to see, very special. So yeah, great thing.
Back to the main topic, Joe suggests electromagnetic pulse as a way to harm an enemy satellite. Would that work?
Yes and no. Firstly, let me back up and explain what EMP is. So EMP can be generated a couple of different ways. The main thing, the radiation, remember these bombs put out radiation, they interact with something. It can interact with our air up high, if it's up in space, or it can interact with the materials of a satellite or a missile. And that causes electric currents to flow. And that electricity, just like if you have a lightning strike and electricity goes into the back of your TV and blows up the TV, that happens. Well, firstly, all of our space assets and all of our ground military assets have protection from EMP. There are special techniques you can use and how they're designed. And in fact, we've done EMP tests on everything.
Yay.
So that does not kill them. So that's a very big deal. There are still concerns about our internet grid, for example. If there was to be a high altitude burst, there's a lot of questions about, are we really EMP proof on some other areas? But generally, firstly, from our military perspective, EMP has been something we've been working on for a long time, and it protects things. So if you remember the Matrix movies, they had an EMP device on their thing that would, kill all the little machines that were coming after them. The technology works; it does do that.
Speaking of EMP, would it be possible to destroy the banking system with EMP? Like my bank is always trying to get me to go paperless, and call me paranoid or old or whatever. I think, what if the whole thing goes poof? I want something on paper that says you owe me this amount of money. Am I being crazy? Could EMP just make it all? I mean, there's no money has absolutely no value except that we trust. We have this agreement,
Right.
But an EMP would put a whole monkey wrench in those works. I think. I mean,
Well, potentially, but we also have to admit that fundamentally, if you have high altitude EMP bursts that are big enough to be destroying our whole digital economy, we're in very serious deep doo-doo as a whole. I mean, that means a full-blown nuclear conflict is going on.
oh, all right.
So all going well, that's not going to happen. I think if you're looking at electronic commerce, I'd be much more worried about cybersecurity than I would be about a nuclear effect.
I am worried about that. Do you?
I mean that's the biggest risk, because we know there are entities out there that are actually trying to use that against us.
Do you do any cybersecurity that most people don't do? Are you extreme on it? Any hints? If someone really wanted to be as secure as possible?
I don't do anything that's out of the ordinary
right.
myself. But there are companies. In fact, the company I used to work for, they have a big, SAI and Leidos have big divisions who are under contract to be working on those problems. Like how do you protect stuff so that cyber attacks don't mess things up?
Well, I really, really appreciate your time. This has been excellent. And maybe next time, I don't think we covered this publicly, but the Webb telescopes, maybe we can talk about what the Webb telescope has discovered potentially in terms of expansion of the universe, and that it's not what was originally calculated, perhaps, and what that might mean for the Big Bang Theory. Because the whole Big Bang Theory is just reverse engineering of expansion, right? They just assume, well, if it's expanding,
Right.
you take that all the way back. But if it's not expanding like they thought, maybe that's up for debate. As you know, I'm a skeptic on the Big Bang Theory, because if for no other reason, it's just so arbitrary. Why nothing, and then everything. It's tough for me to buy. I need a reason. So we'll see. Is that something we can cover next time?
Absolutely, we can talk about that. In fact, I was just at the American Astronomical Society meeting and learning all the latest results. So yeah,
Good.
Let's use that for our next conversation. That'll be great.
Yeah, and let's do it in no more than a month.
Oh yeah, next couple of weeks, let's do it.
All right. And now in the background there, you have a nice background, Mountains of Stars. Why don't you remind the people what Mountains of Stars is all about? Our
big program here, which is named Mountains of Stars, We do a whole range of science programs for the public. And our website, mountainsofstars.org, has lots and lots of cool resources and materials. There are webinars and podcasts. Many of the conversations that Bradley and I have had over the last many years, it's been quite a few years we've been doing this. We have those topics that are up there, books,
Yeah.
references, videos. Please check those things out. We hope that you'll learn a lot about the universe and how we're connected to it. And from that, I hope you'll think about our place on Earth a little differently. That's our goal, is to get people to understand where we fit in. And when you think about the whole universe, that's a great way to learn about it.
Right.
That's our program.
As you mentioned how long we've known each other. It has been a significant time now. Doug initially used to come down and be live on my radio show on WBZ for a couple hours at night, and would drive all the way down from the White Mountains, which I really appreciated. Happily, you don't have to make that trip these days. You save that 2.5 hours down and 2.5 hours back. And so this is a lot easier. So I'm looking forward to the next one. I'll send you an invitation to get that set up real soon. And folks, if you know any scientifically oriented folks like Joe, the person that here, Joe, share this and make sure, if you know of anybody that's into this kind of stuff, that you share this with them. And I once again, thank you so much. Let me end this while I could keep on talking and dilute the whole thing, but this is a good place to end the